Imagine being told you or your child will never work, never date, never write a poem, never use the bathroom independently, that you're a burden, that you destroy families. These are the exact words RFK Jr. used to describe autistic people. Today, we're talking about the harm, the backlash, and how we, as professionals and advocates, move forward together. Welcome to our podcast, Action Insights, the intersection between ABA and mental health. My name is Nikki Dione, and this is my colleague and friend.
Amelia Dalphonse.
And we are going to talk about autism, ableism, and outrage, and responding to RFK's remarks about autistic individuals and the harm that they have caused. A couple things before we get started. We will not be offering CEUs for this podcast. This podcast is living solely in, well, some of the research and information that we have access to, but also personal kind of standpoints and opinions that both Amy and I have in regard to this. We were talking oh gosh, this week and planning on recording podcasts because we record, together since we're in different states. We have to do a lot of planning around it. And the conversation came up about kind of where things are at and the impact that RFK's speech has had on the autistic community and their supports. And, talking about that when we have powerful public figures spreading dangerous ideas about any community. Specifically, we're talking about, the autistic community, that silence isn't neutral, right? Like if we aren't saying something, that we are complicit. And so we decided that today that we would respond, to this kind of conversation. Also kind of clarifying, and I'll say this for myself, but I think Amy would agree, like we are not speaking as individuals with lived experience as autistic individuals. However, um, I'll say this for my belief, and Amy can nod or not, but I believe that part of the work that we do is advocacy. There's a social justice piece that comes with what we do, and when we support in communities that are discriminated against, where ableism can exist, where stigmatization exists, that it is our part of our job to also advocate and protect and support and walk alongside those communities, right? Depending on kind of what we can do. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about, you know, what RFK said and the impact that has had on the community at large and the harm that it's had.
Yeah, he had some really egregious statements. It was surprising to me that somebody so public could make such bold statements. So if you haven't watched his speech yet, I'm sure you've heard about it, but some of the specific things that he said were these are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them never use a toilet unassisted, and autism destroys families. So those are exact quotes from things that he said. And yet, so many of the children that I work with grow up to have a job. And if they have a job, they have to pay taxes. Whether or not they play baseball, that's usually a personal preference, not a lack of ability. I mean, it might be a lack of like athletic ability because, no one wants to see me play baseball either. So does that make me kind of unworthy? I don't know about that. And I had boy, how old was he at the time? He must have been, I worked with him for 7 years, so it's hard for me to gauge how old he was when he did it, but I think he was probably around 11 or 12. He didn't speak vocally. He used a voice output device with LAMP, Words for Life in it. And he actually wrote a poem in his device. And it was literally the sweetest thing. I wish I could remember the whole thing, but the last line was about watching the wind blow the trees because that was something that he loved to do. And the last line was, and it makes me happy. And I just get so, it was the most beautiful thing. So he could write poetry. they'll never go on a date. There's a whole TV series around dating on the spectrum. I mean, it's literally a TV show. Of course, autistic people can date and they can get married and they can have full lives. And then the most ridiculous one was many of them will never use the toilet unassisted. I mean, that's just it. I don't I don't actually work with too many autistic children who can't use the bathroom independently. But what this does is it creates expectations that these kids that we're working with have a ceiling to their abilities. And then when there are those implied ceilings, if people buy into that, they stop trying. They stop believing that these kids are capable. And it's a topic for another podcast episode. But here in Florida, we have these autism classrooms. I'm not going to talk about it because I could talk very strongly about them. But it essentially, we just end up warehousing these kids and not actually helping them reach their potential because we don't see what they're fully capable of. We don't see that.
Yeah. And I think I'm just listening to you and I'm like getting all fired up over here. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna try not to talk fast because that's what happens when I get all fiery. But I think what you're talking to is the danger in ableism, right? It's the danger in so and I want to be clear, like, because I think I always get nervous kind of stepping into this for myself because this isn't about politics. This isn't about, any of those things. This is genuinely about a public figure making statements about an entire community that promotes ableism and promotes ableist language, right? And that starts this narrative that we should be thinking of people as less than.
Mhm.
And that is dangerous and that is harmful. And what it does is it reduces autistic individuals and people to this list of deficits, of things that they will never be, of the quote unquote burden that they place on society because they'll never pay taxes and they won't work and they, significantly are, negatively impacting the places that they're in. So that's what this language does. That's what this belief system and putting it out. Annie's a public figure. This speech was out across the nation and probably the world in many places. And when we use language that is ableist and that, kind of promotes a community as less than, it promotes fear, it promotes pity, it promotes disgust. It starts to allow for segregation and discrimination and abuse to happen. And that's where we start to see the fallout because, and I won't go too far into it, but there's a lot of research, and I encourage people to read about minority stress and this, kind of discrimination and, stigmatization that minority communities experience. And one of the things that happens, the fallout, is that people can start to internalize these messages, especially people who are just learning about, right? Like their experience as an autistic individual or families are learning about their family member, and their family experience having an autistic individual in their family. It's hard not to internalize those messages. And so then people start to think that they're bad. They start to think that they can't do these things. And the kind of rope of harm that happens becomes long-term and integrated. And minority stress is something that I think is important for us to think about in all of this too, right? And how are we supporting our people that we're working with, but also understanding that when individuals experience this language and it's against identity, right? The likelihood that they start to think about how the world sees them and it creates this disparity, and that's where trauma happens. That's where harm happens because now the communities that we're in, like that minority individuals are in, is discriminating against their identity. And that's where that trauma gap, that's where we see mental health challenges pop in, anxiety, depression, right? And so, I think that's not all of it, but that's part of the harm. I'm sorry, I'm on a roll, Amy. I'm just going to keep going. And you were talking about kids, but I work with adults too.
Yeah.
I work with adults who hold down full-time jobs, are married, have children, contribute to their communities, they volunteer, they pay their taxes, right? And so whenever we're talking about communities with and providing whatever it is that we think we need to provide without their voices at the table, we are doing harm just foundationally, right?
Yeah. And it, I can just imagine what parents are feeling. And especially the parents whose child just received an autism diagnosis. And now they're hearing all of these things. My child will never do these things. And it's like you said, a public figure. So we believe them. And there it just diminishes hope. He literally said that autism destroys families. And it's I can't imagine being a parent of an autistic child hearing that
Mhm.
and understanding that that's the expectation.
Right.
And all of this stuff, this is the stuff that drives policy. This is the stuff, like you said, creates segregation. This is what causes the stupid autism classrooms, which I
Mhm.
won't talk about too much because that's another episode. But I clearly have strong opinions about that stuff because it separates autistics from non-autistics for arbitrary reasons. There's no good reason
Right.
to, I don't think there's ever a good reason to separate groups of people anyways, but um I'm totally off topic here, but because I can so get into all of this, but it's the public policies. And
Right.
the reasons these things creep up is because of statements like this and the beliefs that and the fear that it provokes in the general population.
Right. And kind of thinking that, and I agree. Like that's why we're not doing CUs. This is like totally like opinion, like where are we going to go with this conversation? But I agree, like separating somebody out based solely on identity or what community they're part of it's never a good move. Right? It's never
Never
something that's
justified.
done. Well, it's never something that's done in the interest of the person that they're moving into another space. What it is it's to alleviate something for the person who has to manage or support, right? Like if I put all my autistic kids in one classroom and it's the autism classroom, it's not about the autistic kids getting better access to supports or working on meaningful skills. What it is to separate out and not have other people in the environment have to, quote unquote, deal with whatever the changes might be or the needs might be. So whenever we're doing that, it's based solely in discrimination and stigma. You can't tell me anything different. If somebody is brought out of a classroom because they need more individualized treatment around learning a specific thing, but they get to go back into the classroom, that's not what we're talking about because that's based off of like an equity need, right? Like not everyone needs the same accommodations to meet the same goals. And so we individualize that, but if somebody's pulled out just because they're autistic, that you're pulling somebody out because of identity, not because of a need of that person. And I think it speaks to what we're talking about, right? Like when we have these public messages, it gives permission. And I'm not saying we should be giving permission, but the people who do it feel like they're like in the right. They're like, yeah, this is what we should be doing. And it's not what we should be doing, right? And the policy risk around it is that it shapes public funding. It shapes education, employment, healthcare, right? When we start to other people, when we start to separate people out because of identity or because of disability or whatever, kind of race, like ethnicity, right? We could fill in all these blanks. It starts to create the disparity in power and access to care. And it creates a lot of other kind of internalized stress, externalized stress. And I was thinking I went to a training that I was giving a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about that kind of internalized stress and that people in my world for therapy, because I work with individuals of all ages. So I have an autistic client who is in their late 60s, all the way down, and my youngest client right now is 18 months old, right? So I see across the lifespan in a th mental health therapy perspective. Um, that when we start to, pull people out, the impact that it has is significant on their mental health. So nobody walks in my office, my mental health office, because they're autistic. They come into into therapy because the stress that they've experienced, minority stressed, discrimination, communities or environments not adjusting to accommodate all needs. That's the gap that I mentioned before that's causing harm. That's where anxiety, depression, and trauma live. It's not because somebody's autistic that these things are happening. It's the impact of the environment that they're in that causes that gap. And when we have, again, public figures who are spreading misinformation, I mean lies, right? Like that harm gap, it just increases. And I think it's just so not okay. I don't have any better words for it right now.
Right. And it impacts, negatively impacts everything because it negatively impacts even things like the economy. Because if you think about it, autistics are actually have some of the highest rate of unemployment. And now employers have heard that autistics can't use the bathroom independently. So why are you going to hire an autistic? They can't play baseball, so we can't hire an autistic. If even if you hear it and you don't buy into it fully, hearing those statements from a public figure does influence your thinking.
Mhm.
And especially if you're not actively engaged in a conversation like this that is opposed to that statement. Um,
Right,
and so, how much harder has this made it for autistic individuals to get a job
right.
and maintain a job? Because are there now employers who have this thought in the back of their head that think, well, this autistic that I hired is struggling. This is all they'll ever be able to do. This is the best they'll ever be able to do. It's not going
Mhm.
to work out. I can't do it. Rather than taking a more optimistic viewpoint and where if we give anyone the right supports, autistic, non autistic, if we give them the supports that they need, they can succeed at anything they choose to do.
Right. Right. And that's like the conversation. And again, I know we could probably talk for hours on this stuff, but that's the conversation around like, equity and equality. Like, not everything has to look the same for everyone because everybody has different needs, right? There are people who are not autistic, individuals who still have other needs, right? That we might not be aware of or that we are aware of. And it doesn't devalue their ability to contribute in their communities or in society. I use that term, society, in any negative way. Um, and I think that the hard part is thinking, so we have all this like kind of fire, I have all this fiery, like I'm like having angst. I can't even imagine what um people who have lived experiences autistics like are feeling right now. And I can only speak to what I know in the context of therapy, but the last few weeks for a lot of my autistic clients, we are talking about systemic harm. We are talking about ableism. We are talking about the fear that they're experiencing based off of this, kind of this news, whatever thing that RFK had, like about how their employers are going to start to see them, how their neighbors are going to start to view them, especially for people who are very open about, being autistic and, being as their autistic identity. And, I've been doing a lot of talking and thinking, and, even in my state, and I think other states now they're talking about doing a registry for autistic individuals. So if I diagnose somebody as autistic, I'm supposed to register them. It existed before and then it went away. And now it's coming back just, to have like statistics. But anytime we have registries for identity, It's not just about providing care, right? Like, why do we need to have people on a registry? Um, and so like as a professional, like I'm starting to think about like what is my professional obligation, right? What is my ethical obligation? As a human, what are my values? And how am I like, making sure that I'm supporting as somebody who's hopefully walking alongside autistic individuals that I'm supporting in the way that I can. And I said this earlier, but like I foundationally believe that as BCBAs, we have a professional and ethical obligation to advocate with our clients, not just for them. So, how are we supporting and walking alongside the clients and families that we're working with who are going to be and are significantly impacted by this language, right? By these words that are out there. And if we look at our ethical codes, right? And I'm so happy that we like, kind of think about this beforehand, but like so 1.01, dignity and respect, right? 1.06, cultural responsiveness and awareness, and 1.07 is advocacy. Like it's in our ethical codes around how we support and walk alongside the clients that we're working with and the families that we're working with, or how we educate others, right, in our collaborative and community work.
And I think a lot of it just comes down to really kind of um, supporting them in how they're feeling and giving them a safe space to share their thoughts on all of this. Um, I think we need to just make sure that we're validating their concerns and their fears, um, and that we are doing our best to stand to speak out publicly as we can, or as publicly as we're comfortable against statements like this, and sharing our experiences that are in direct opposition to the statements that he's made. It's like he chose one specific profile of what he believes an autistic person looks like and has generalized that to the entire population of anyone who has ever been diagnosed autistic.
Yeah.
Rather than understanding that we're autism isn't really it's not a disability. These When we're working with autistic individuals, it's a neurological difference. And that's
Mm.
kind of something that he's neglected. Some of the individuals who are autistic might also have other challenges that make it difficult for them to do other things. They might have some cognitive challenges. They might have some other challenges, but it's not autism that's the problem. And he's not differentiating that.
Right.
But if we can help families understand that, if we can speak out about our experiences and make as much of an impact as we can, I think those are the steps that we can do in light of this.
And I think as you were talking, I was both listening and thinking because I did have a conversation, I don't remember, like maybe this was before this all happened, but I think it applies to this where we were talking about, well, I was talking with some other mental health colleagues around, our like what does advocacy look like as a professional? What does it look like as a, in my personal life and like when they align or are they different? Like how do I balance all of this, right? That was the context of that conversation. And, as you were kind of talking, Amy, I was thinking, advocacy looks different for all of us. So as a human and a professional, I have to be comfortable with what I'm doing for advocacy. And I don't want to speak for or overstep the individuals that I'm, trying to support or advocate with. And so for some people, it might be doing the work that you're doing and helping individuals, if they can, like process their feelings or, readjust things or supporting families or connecting them with resources. For other people, it might be going, writing letters to your state representatives or, joining community gatherings or, it can look so different for everybody. So advocacy, when I'm talking about like our obligation is to advocate, I'm not saying like to go on the front lines and, pick in and drive up to wherever you need to drive to like, make your voice heard. That might be something that you take on. I work with a lot of people who, from a funding policy perspective, will advocate, in that perspective. They go and speak at their state house. They go and do those things. I don't think I would ever be comfortable doing that. That is not the advocacy that I think would fit for who I am as a person. So like really thinking about how are we in the moment supporting our clients, especially if they are feeling distress around these conversations or this language that has been now put out and broadcast, everywhere. And are there other things that our autistic advocates and community are asking of us that we can do, that we feel comfortable doing? And that's right, that's kind of where that kind of social justice piece lives. And I always used to joke that I went to school for mental health counseling and I probably should have gone for social work because I do have like a little bit of that fiery social justice piece as part of who I am. But how are we, what am I comfortable with? How am I walking alongside? How can I call out that systemic oppression where I see it? And sometimes it might even be something as simple um, and I did this in a training a couple weeks ago around language, right? So somebody said something and I would like to offer a different way to think about this, or I'd like to offer some information that we have from our autistic, colleagues, our autistic community around language and just even shifting some language and having people go, thank you so much for telling me because the way that we do it is supportive and informational and educational and collaborative and all those fun words that we fill in, right? So that even that is advocacy and social justice. So really thinking about like how do we start to support our autistic, families and individuals and kind of meet them where they're at and like also like disseminate information or resources into our communities and the people that we're working with.
Right. And I think that we all have our own individual types of platforms. I'm going to use the word platform, but I don't mean that we're actually standing on at a podium or anything, but we all, like you said, have our own individual ways that we can make an impact, and whether it's public statements or just, I say but supporting a family and talking about it and sharing with them some positive experiences that these statements aren't fact, that they aren't um, directly uh, they're not all autistics experiences, and helping families understand and manage that.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that statement of like so like what do we do when our communities are hurting? What do we do when our, even colleagues are hurting or we are hurting? There, are a lot of autistic individuals that I know that are mental health counselors that are I know some BCBAs who are autistic, right? Like so where it's not just that we are like I'm me and I just go to work and I do the thing. Like people have multiple identities and roles that they are experiencing and living every day. And so I really appreciate you kind of, saying that, Amy. So it's important to think too in this place that we're in currently is, we're here to support our families and our clients. And as Amy mentioned earlier, validating their experience, being mindful how we're framing, things, acknowledging emotions, and how are we taking care of ourselves as practitioners, right? Like I've been so, I like rotate between like anger and sadness and like some despair and like disbelief. Like I'm just in all these places. And then I go into therapy sessions, literally hour after hour after hour to support individuals who are directly impacted by this. And like I'm a person too, right? So how am I balancing all those things and still making sure that my practice is aligning with my values and my ethics and my personal belief of like the drive for like advocacy and social justice. Like how are we managing all of those things, especially when things and are hard and tough.
That's a that's a tough one. Our our role is really hard, and I have a lot of respect for everyone who is doing the work every day showing up for their clients and their families and helping all of them support them through all of this. But
Right.
that is the end of our episode for today. And
It
as much
is.
as I would love to just keep chatting about this topic, we will end today. And our next episode will be on PDA, pathological demand avoidance, or as Nikki likes to call it.
Persistent drive for autonomy. I was also going to throw in that the one after that, I'm pretty sure is going to be on
Yeah,
compassion fatigue too. So we
yeah.
have some good ones coming up that I think will be helpful in regard to kind of the state of where things are at and all of the emotions and things that we may be experiencing.
So make sure to check back with us soon. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.